The dust hung thick in the air as Grace Reynolds pulled her rickety cart down the main street of Miles City, Montana Territory, her stomach gnawing at her insides with each step. The year was 1883, and the drought that had ravaged the region had left more than just the land parched. It had dried up her family's livelihood and hopes along with it. The loaves of bread stacked in her cart represented her last desperate attempt to make enough money to feed herself and send something back to her ailing father and younger siblings. The noon sun beat down mercilessly as Grace paused to wipe sweat from her brow with a tattered sleeve. At 22, her once plump cheeks had hollowed, and her calico dress hung loose on her frame. It had been 2 days since her last proper meal, and the irony of pushing a cart full of bread while starving wasn't lost on her. But each loaf was precious inventory. Selling them meant survival. Bread. "Fresh bread," she called, her voice cracking from thirst. Few heads turned. Miles City was experiencing its own hardships, and luxury purchases like store-bought bread were rare when most folks could barely afford flour. From the doorway of the Dusty Boot Saloon, Jacob Ryder observed the woman with the bread cart. At 28, he'd seen his share of hard times and desperate folks during his years as a cattle driver turned small ranch owner. Something in the woman's determined posture, despite her obvious exhaustion, caught his attention. "Ain't seen her round these parts before," remarked Hank, the weathered bartender, as he polished a glass behind Jacob. "Looks like she's about ready to collapse," Jacob noted, his brow furrowing beneath his worn Stetson. "How much you reckon she's made today?" Hank shrugged. "Not enough, judgin' by the full cart and empty street." Jacob stepped off the boardwalk, his spurs jingling softly as he crossed the dusty street toward the woman. Up close, he could see the pallor beneath her sun-kissed skin and the slight tremble in her hands as she arranged and rearranged her wares. "Afternoon, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "That's quite a selection you've got there." Grace looked up, momentarily startled by the tall figure now blocking her son. His face was partially shadowed by his hat, but she could make out kind eyes and a strong jaw softened by several days' worth of stubble. "Yes, sir," she replied, straightening her back and summoning a businesslike tone. "Best bread you'll find in the territory, made fresh this morning." "Would you care to buy a loaf?" The hopeful note in her voice betrayed her desperation. Jacob glanced at the bread, then back at her face. He noted how she swayed slightly on her feet. "When's the last time you ate, miss?" he asked quietly. Grace blinked, taken aback by the direct question. "That's not." She faltered, pride warring with exhaustion. Just then, a wave of dizziness swept over her. Grace reached for the cart to steady herself, but her vision darkened at the edges. The last thing she registered was the stranger's strong hands catching her before she hit the ground. When Grace awoke, she was lying on a worn but clean sofa in what appeared to be the back room of a saloon. The smell of beef stew made her stomach clench painfully. "Easy there," came a deep voice. The cowboy from the street moved into her field of vision, holding a cup of water. "Take small sips." Grace pushed herself up on her elbows, mortification washing over her. "My bread, your cart's safe, tied up outside," Jacob assured her. "Hank's keeping an eye on it. Name's Jacob Ryder, by the way." "Grace Reynolds," she replied automatically, accepting the water with shaking hands. "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Ryder. I don't normally. That is, I haven't been." "Hungry? Yeah, I figured as much." Jacob nodded to a bowl steaming on a small table nearby. "There's stew there when you feel ready, no rush." Grace stared at the food, battling between pride and desperate need. "I can pay you," she said firmly. "From my earnings today." Something like sadness crossed Jacob's face. "No need. Consider it neighborly courtesy." "I don't take charity," she insisted, even as her stomach growled loudly enough for both to hear. Jacob sat in a chair across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. "Tell you what, Miss Reynolds, you eat that stew and then maybe you can tell me your story. And if you're so set on making this a business arrangement, I've been meaning to stock up on bread. My ranch hands would appreciate something besides my sorry attempts at biscuits." Grace hesitated only a moment longer before reaching for the bowl. The first spoonful nearly brought tears to her eyes. Rich broth, tender beef, and vegetables that reminded her of better days on her family's farm. "This is wonderful," she managed between careful bites, determined not to eat too quickly and make herself sick. Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Hank's got away with a stew pot, one of the reasons I stop by so often." As Grace ate, the color gradually returned to her cheeks. Jacob didn't rush her, just poured her more water when needed and occasionally answered questions from Hank, who popped his head in to check on them. When she finally set the empty bowl aside, Grace felt human again for the first time in days. "Thank you, Mr. Ryder." "Jacob," he corrected gently. "Jacob," she echoed, folding her hands in her lap. "I suppose I owe you that explanation now, only if you're inclined to share it." Something about his patient demeanor made it easy to talk. Grace found herself explaining how her family had lost their wheat farm near Helena to drought and debt after her mother's passing. Her father had fallen ill, leaving Grace to care for him and her 3 younger siblings. "I came to Miles City hoping to find better opportunities," she concluded. "Our neighbor taught me to bake bread years ago, and it seemed a practical way to earn money. I've been traveling through small towns for nearly a month now." Jacob listened attentively, turning his hat in his hands. "That's a heavy burden for someone to carry alone." "We do what we must," Grace replied simply. "Indeed we do," he agreed. "Now, about that bread, I wasn't just making excuses. I've got a small spread about 5 miles outside of town, 6 ranch hands who'd be mighty grateful for something that doesn't taste like leather." A flicker of hope lit in Grace's chest. "How many loaves would you need?" "Let's say 2 dozen to start. That should keep the boys happy for a few days, at least," Grace quickly calculated in her head. 2 dozen loaves would be her best sale, yet enough to secure a room at the boarding house for several nights and still send money home. "I can have them ready by tomorrow morning," she offered. Jacob nodded, standing up. "Perfect. I'll swing by and pick them up. Where are you staying?" The question caught her off guard. I haven't secured lodgings yet. I was hoping to make enough today to afford the boarding house." Understanding dawned in Jacob's eyes, but to his credit, he didn't offer pity. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out several bills. "Consider this an advance payment for the bread," he said, holding out the money. "More than enough for a room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house down the street. She's a fair woman, keeps clean rooms." Grace hesitated. "That's too much for an advance." "Then the rest is for the supplies you'll need," Jacob countered smoothly. "Can't have my ranch hands eating subpar bread, now can I?" A small smile tugged at Grace's lips despite herself. "You drive a hard bargain, Mr. Ryder, Jacob," he reminded her with a wink. "And I've been told I'm stubborn as a mule." That evening, Grace settled into a modest but clean room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. The elderly widow had clucked sympathetically upon hearing Grace's situation and had even offered the use of her kitchen for baking. "That Jacob Ryder's a good sort," Mrs. Peterson commented as she showed Grace to the kitchen. "Lost his parents to influenza when he was just 20. Built that ranch of his from nothing but determination and hard work." Grace nodded, storing away this piece of information about her new customer. "He seems kind." "Kind, yes, but not soft," Mrs. Peterson clarified. "Man's respected in these parts for his fair dealings and straight talk. Not many like him left these days." Through the night, Grace worked tirelessly, preparing and baking the promised 2 dozen loaves. The familiar motions of kneading dough and the comforting smell of baking bread soothed her frayed nerves. By dawn, 24 golden brown loaves were cooling on every available surface in Mrs. Peterson's kitchen. True to his word, Jacob arrived just after sunrise, his wagon parked outside. The surprise on his face when he saw the quantity and quality of the bread was evident. "Miss Reynolds, these look better than anything I've seen at the town bakery," he said, inhaling the aroma appreciatively. "Family recipe," Grace explained, helping him carefully load the loaves into crates. "My mother taught me when I was barely tall enough to reach the table." Their hands brushed as they worked, and Grace found herself noticing details about Jacob she'd been too hungry and exhausted to observe the day before the laugh lines around his eyes. The careful gentleness of his calloused hands, the way he listened attentively when she spoke. "I'd be obliged if you'd consider making this a regular arrangement." Jacob said as they loaded the last crate. "My men would riot if I showed up with this today and nothing next week." Grace felt a flutter of something beyond mere relief at the prospect of steady income. "I'd be happy to, Mr. Ryder Jacob," she corrected herself with a small smile. "Good," he replied, tipping his hat. Same time next week, and so began a routine. Each week, Grace would prepare bread for Jacob's ranch, and he would arrive to collect it, often staying for a cup of coffee and conversation. Mrs. Peterson observed their growing friendship with knowing eyes, but kept her thoughts to herself. As the weeks passed, Grace established a modest but successful business in Miles City. Word of her exceptional bread spread, and soon she had regular customers beyond just Jacob's ranch. She rented a small storefront and sent for her youngest sister, Emma, to help with the increasing demand. Jacob became a fixture in her life, stopping by not just for bread but to help with repairs to the shop, to bring news from the outlying areas, or sometimes with no reason at all beyond wishing to see her. Grace found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that went beyond business interest. One crisp autumn day, nearly 3 months after their first meeting, Jacob arrived at the shop just as Grace was closing up. The evening light cast long shadows across the boardwalk, and the air carried the first hints of the coming winter. "Thought you might like to see something," he said without preamble. "If you're not too tired, that is." Grace glanced at the finished chores and her waiting sister. "Go on," Emma encouraged with a poorly concealed smile. "I can handle things here." The ride out to Jacob's ranch was filled with comfortable conversation about their respective days. Grace had visited once before when Jacob had hosted a small gathering for Independence Day, but tonight the homestead looked different, bathed in the golden light of sunset. "It's not much," Jacob said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it's mine. Paid off the last of the bank note last month." "It's wonderful," Grace replied honestly, taking in the sturdy main house, the well-maintained barn, and the corrals where several horses gazed curiously at them. Jacob led her to a fenced pasture behind the house where a dozen cattle grazed peacefully. "These are new," he explained. "Start of a breeding program I've been saving for. With these and the ones coming next spring, I'll be able to expand considerable." Grace recognized what he was really saying, that his future was becoming more secure, that his dreams were taking solid shape. "Jacob, that's wonderful. You must be proud." He turned to her, his expression earnest in the fading light. "Grace, I didn't just bring you out here to show you cattle. Well, I wanted to ask you something." Her heart quickened as he took her hands in his. "These past months, having you in my life, it's changed things. Changed me. I find myself thinking about you when you're not around, looking forward to seeing you even when I don't need bread." Grace squeezed his hands gently, encouraging him to continue. "What I'm trying to say, probably poorly, is that I care for you, deeply, and I was wondering if you might consider, that is, if you might feel—" "Yes," Grace said softly, "I do feel the same." Relief and joy washed over Jacob's features. "You do?" "I do," she confirmed, feeling her cheeks warm. "I think perhaps I have since that first day when you fed a starving stranger with no expectation of return." Jacob's smile was brilliant in the dusk. "Grace Reynolds, may I court you properly? With your permission, I'd like to call on you, take you to dinner, maybe even the harvest dance next month." Grace laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her. "I would like nothing better." Their courtship progressed with the steady rhythm of two people who knew their own minds and hearts. Jacob called on Grace 3 times a week, sometimes bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry, once a beautiful blue ribbon for her hair. They attended socials together, rode across his land on Sunday afternoons, and shared dreams beneath starlit skies. By the time winter painted the Montana landscape in shades of white and gray, their devotion to each other was common knowledge in Miles City. Grace's bakery thrived, allowing her to send for her father and remaining siblings. Jacob helped secure them a small house near Grace's shop and even hired her 16-year-old brother as a ranch hand. The holiday season arrived with a festive air despite the cold. On Christmas Eve, Grace closed the bakery early and joined Jacob for a special dinner at his ranch. He had decorated the main house with evergreen boughs and candles, and a small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the sitting room. "It's beautiful," Grace gasped as she entered, taking in the transformed space. "Had some help from Mrs. Peterson," Jacob admitted with a chuckle. "My decorating skills are somewhat lacking." The evening was perfect, a delicious meal prepared by Jacob, who had been practicing his cooking, warm conversation by the fire, and the exchange of thoughtfully chosen gifts. Grace had knitted Jacob a warm scarf in rich brown wool while he presented her with a delicate silver locket. "Open it," he urged softly. Inside was a tiny photograph of the two of them, taken at the harvest dance by a traveling photographer. Grace's eyes misted as she looked at their smiling faces. "I love it," she whispered. "And I love you, Jacob Ryder." It was the first time either had spoken those words aloud, though they had been felt for months. Jacob's eyes widened, then softened. "I love you too, Grace." "More than I thought possible." He took her hands in his. "Which is why I was hoping." He slid from his chair to one knee, still holding her hands. Grace's breath caught as she realized what was happening. "Grace Reynolds, you came into my life hungry and in need, but you've given me far more than I ever gave you. You've filled empty spaces in my heart I didn't know existed. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled onto Grace's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Jacob." "Yes, with all my heart." The kiss they shared sealed their promise, tender and full of hope for their future together. They married in the spring of 1884 when the prairie was dotted with wildflowers and new life abounded. The entire town of Miles City seemed to attend, from Grace's regular customers to Jacob's ranch hands to Mrs. Peterson, who dabbed at her eyes throughout the ceremony. "Never seen a more fitting pair," the older woman declared at the reception. "From the moment he carried her into my boarding house that day, I knew." Their wedding night was a tender discovery of each other, both nervous but trusting in their love. Jacob's gentle reverence of Grace's body matched the care he'd always shown for her heart, and they found in each other a passion neither had experienced before. Life as a married couple brought adjustments, but also deep contentment. Grace continued to run her bakery with Emma's help, though she now split her time between town and the ranch. Jacob expanded his cattle operation, his confidence growing with Grace's unwavering support. That summer, they traveled to visit Grace's childhood home near Helena, making peace with the difficult memories there. Standing in the overgrown fields of the failed wheat farm, Grace leaned against Jacob's strong shoulder. "It feels different now," she observed. "Less like failure and more like a beginning that led me to you." Jacob wrapped an arm around her waist. "Everything that brought you to Miles City that day was a blessing in disguise then, for both of us." The following winter brought news that filled their home with anticipation. Grace was expecting their first child. Jacob's joy knew no bounds as he carefully added a nursery to their house, crafting a cradle with his own hands during the long evenings. "You're going to be a wonderful father," Grace told him one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "I hope so," he replied, a rare uncertainty in his voice. "My own father was a good man, but he wasn't one for showing affection." Grace turned to face him in the darkness. "You show your love in everything you do, Jacob. It's who you are." Their daughter, Lily, was born in the late summer of 1885, with Jacob pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until the midwife finally allowed him in. The sight of his wife holding their newborn daughter reduced the strong rancher to tears of wonder. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching Lily's tiny hand, "just like her mother." Parenthood deepened their bond as they navigated sleepless nights and the countless joys of watching their daughter grow. Grace managed to balance motherhood with her business, often carrying Lily in a sling as she kneaded dough or served customers. Jacob proved to be the devoted father Grace had predicted, reading to Lily each night and taking her on inspections of the ranch as soon as she could sit securely in front of him on his horse. The ranch hands, many of whom had been with Jacob for years, became doting honorary uncles to the little girl with her father's kind eyes and her mother's determined spirit. 2 years later, they welcomed a son they named Samuel, completing their family. The Ryder Ranch flourished along with their children, becoming known throughout the territory for its quality cattle and the warmth of its hospitality. Grace never forgot how their story began with hunger and a cart of bread that she couldn't afford to eat. Each year on the anniversary of their first meeting, she would bake a special loaf of bread, and they would share it together, remembering how kindness had laid the foundation for their love. By 1890, the Ryder Ranch had expanded to over 500 acres. Jacob had become a respected figure in Montana's cattle industry, known for his fair dealings and innovative breeding practices. Grace's Bakery, now managed primarily by Emma, supplied bread to establishments throughout Miles City and even to the railway dining cars that stopped at the station. "Did you ever imagine this?" Jacob asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching 6-year-old Lily and 4-year-old Samuel chase fireflies in the twilight. Grace smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Never in my wildest dreams. I was just hoping to survive another day when I pulled that cart into Miles City. And I was just hoping to find decent bread," Jacob chuckled, kissing the top of her head. "Instead, I found everything I never knew I wanted. Life wasn't without its challenges." The harsh winter of 1891 threatened their cattle herds and tested Jacob's leadership. When fever swept through Miles City in 1892, Grace spent weeks nursing not only their children but many townsfolk as well. Through every trial, their partnership remained unshakable, each supporting the other's strengths and compensating for weaknesses. As the 19th century drew to a close, Montana changed around them. The territory achieved statehood, railways connected once isolated communities, and the wild frontier gradually gave way to more settled ways of life. Yet the values that had drawn Grace and Jacob together, kindness, determination, and unwavering devotion, remained constant. Their children grew strong and independent, Lily inheriting her father's head for business and her mother's nurturing spirit, while Samuel developed a gift for working with horses that surpassed even Jacob's considerable skills. Both children understood the story of their parents' meeting, how hunger and bread had somehow led to a legacy of love. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1904, Jacob surprised Grace with a special gift, the deed to a new building in Miles City, larger than her original bakery. "What's this?" Grace asked, confusion evident as she examined the papers. "The future," Jacob replied with a proud smile. "Reynolds Ryder Bakery and Restaurant, big enough to serve proper meals to folks who might otherwise go hungry." Tears filled Grace's eyes as she understood his intent. "A place where people can be fed regardless of their circumstances. Within reason," Jacob clarified with a wink. "We're still running a business after all, but yes, a place that remembers what it means to be hungry and what a difference a meal can make." The Reynolds Ryder Bakery and Restaurant opened the following spring with a simple motto engraved on a plaque by the door: "Enter hungry, leave nourished." A small sign beneath it told the story of a woman with a cart of bread who had arrived hungry and left fed by a cowboy's kindness, forever changing both their lives. Grace and Jacob worked side by side in this new venture, teaching their children the business while continuing to oversee the ranch operations. The restaurant became known not just for its excellent food, but for its policy of providing a meal to those truly in need, a tradition that honored the foundation of the Ryder's love story. As they entered middle age, Grace and Jacob found new joys in watching their children begin their own journeys. Lily married the son of the local doctor and took over management of the restaurant, while Samuel expanded the ranch's focus to include breeding horses, his skill drawing buyers from as far away as California. "They make me proud," Jacob commented one Sunday after both children and their families had visited for dinner. At 51, his dark hair was threaded with silver, and lines of laughter marked his face, but his eyes still held the same kindness that had drawn Grace to him all those years ago. "Me too," Grace agreed, her own beauty matured rather than diminished by the passing years. "Though sometimes I miss when they were small enough to fit in our laps." Jacob pulled her close. "Well, we still have each other's laps available," he teased, earning a playful swat from his wife. "Jacob Ryder, you are incorrigible. "And you love me for it," he countered confidently. "I do," she admitted with a smile. "Every day more than the last." Their love story continued to evolve as the years passed. They weathered the changes that came with the new century automobiles gradually appearing on Miles City streets, electricity illuminating homes that had once relied on lanterns and candles, the Great War taking some of Miles City's young men far from home. Through it all, the story of the hungry woman with the bread cart and the kind cowboy who fed her remained a cornerstone of local folklore. Young couples would sometimes visit the restaurant specifically to hear Grace or Jacob tell the tale, drawing inspiration from a love that had begun with such a simple act of compassion. In 1923, at the age of 62, Grace stood beside Jacob as they welcomed their fifth grandchild into the world. Holding the newborn boy, she was struck by how far they had come from that dusty street where she had nearly collapsed from hunger 40 years earlier. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked softly, his arm secure around her waist. "About how a loaf of bread can change a life," she replied. "About how hungry I was that day and how you fed more than just my body." Jacob's eyes, still bright despite the years, held hers with the same tenderness they always had. "Best decision I ever made, bringing you that bowl of stew." "And the best decision I ever made was accepting it," Grace countered, leaning into his embrace. That evening, back at the ranch house that had been their home for so many years, they sat together on the porch swing that Jacob had built when Lily was born. The Montana sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a fitting backdrop to the peace they had found together. "Would you believe me if I told you I knew even that first day?" Jacob asked suddenly. "Something about you called to me across that street. I just knew you were special." Grace smiled, remembering the handsome cowboy who had appeared like a vision when she needed him most. "I might believe it. After all these years, I've learned that love sometimes knows before we do." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, they remained together on the porch, two hearts that had found in each other exactly what they needed. From hunger to fulfillment, from kindness to love, from a chance meeting to a lifetime together, theirs was a story that would be told in Miles City for generations to come. The legacy of the woman with the cart of bread and the cowboy whose kindness fed her continued long after they were gone, living on in their children, their grandchildren, and in every meal served to a hungry soul at the restaurant that bore their names. For in Miles City, Montana, people still said that true love could be found in the simplest acts of compassion. Just ask anyone who knew the story of Grace and Jacob Ryder.